All right, it's the last Friday in July 2019. I'm Cheryl Fidelman. Happy Fridays with Fidelman. I am a performance artist and life coach, and today's topic is subtle sexual trauma. And I'm also going to sort of throw in the trauma of culture as well in there. And so, so I am interviewing for my next summit, which is called the Trust Yourself Again Summit. The first one earlier this year was called the Trust Yourself Summit. This is the Trust Yourself Again Summit, Heal Your Trauma and Be the Real You in Sex, Family, and Money. And so far in my interviews, I've covered sex, I've covered family, and my next group of interviews, I'm going to be covering money. In any case, I had several interviews this week that I pre-recorded, and I interviewed Dr. Lawrence Heller of NARM, the Neuroaffective Relational Model. Some of you may know his work, and some of you may remember him from the first summit the Trust Yourself Summit that I did earlier this year. And we talked about sexual trauma, and I don't think he said subtle sexual trauma, but from what I gathered from what he was saying, that it's not always that sexual trauma is the impact of some specific event. It can be the impact of or the result of molestation and abuse. It can also be the impact of just how our family and our culture relates to sex over time. It can seem subtle. We can just kind of get used to it, like that's how it is. It can occur as a result of how our families related to sex, how our families related to our bodies, how our families allowed or permitted us to explore our bodies, how they reacted to us exploring our bodies and potentially the bodies of other children. So there's a whole, relationship to the naked body and physicality in our families. So that really had me thinking about the way that I was brought up as when it came to my body. And from what I can remember, so I have an older brother, 6 years older than me, and I always had older boys around. Always. I was practically on some level raised by boys that were 6 years older than me, from the ages of like 6 to 16. So I was around these, raging hormonal boys constantly. And there was an energetic, so as I've shared in previous interviews, there were some actual events, molestation events. One actual true
event.
But over time, it was like I was raised around this sort of like peering energy. This energy, the energy of these boys just always kind of like staring at me, looking at me from different angles. And so I felt this desire at a really young age consistently in my household. And so I became very tomboyish. I covered up. I wore, baggy clothes and long t-shirts and ripped jeans. And I just sort of suppressed or muted my sexuality or the way that I looked or the energy that I put out. And so I became very quiet. There's actually many reasons why I became quiet. And that was in my family dynamic. And that was one of them, right? So that also brings up the idea that we have certain aspects of our personality that are validated and imprinted by many different things. Okay, so my quietness and my suppression was imprinted by my mom being a rageaholic and that sort of forcing me to hold myself back and be quiet and not want to, rock the boat at all. And then additionally, I became, you know, I think that's why I became prey to the bullies in school, because I was automatically quiet and I didn't really speak up for myself, and I just sort of kind of took it. And then at the same time, in my household with these teenage boys that I grew up with, I I didn't want to be taken advantage of sexually, and I felt their sexual desire so strongly that I just sort of suppressed mine. I mean, I didn't really date until after high school, and I wasn't aware of my sexuality or my sexual vibe, because for later on, because I held it back, because it was something that I felt would, if I let it sort of, if I expressed even a little bit of it, it would be, taken as a message to the boys that I grew up with in my home. So this over time can be looked at as something like a subtle sexual trauma, that the culture with which you are brought up in your home, the way sex is viewed, the way the body is viewed, that can instill a particular way of holding yourself. It can instill a particular way that your nervous system will protect you throughout your childhood, and also a particular way that you are told is right. Because I know that in some cultures, the body is shameful, the body is to be covered up, and so this trauma is also the reason why I wanted to bring up culture, like I said earlier, is because trauma is also a result of being told that a belief system that some particular way is the right way to be. And as I was talking to Dr. Helen, I was thinking about this subtle sexual trauma. I just started remembering things that I forgot, impacted me in any sort of way. Like I remember when my dad still lived with us, I think I was like 3 or 4. And I opened the bathroom door, and my dad was naked brushing his teeth. And he slammed the door, and I know it was a mistake, he didn't mean to, but he slammed the door on my finger, and I went screaming to my mother. And my mother, blamed my father. I remember my mom then screaming at my mother then screaming at my father and blaming him for hurting my finger. And I remember him trying to explain to her, I was naked and I didn't want her to see me naked. And I remember knowing my mom was blaming my dad, and he probably shouldn't have gotten in trouble, because that was often in my house where my mom blamed my dad, and he was always trying to say I didn't do anything wrong. But I also remember thinking, I wonder why I couldn't see him naked. It was almost like something that I couldn't find the answer to. Why would that be a big deal that I would see him naked? And that stuck out for me, that experience. And I'm actually going to think about that more, what that sort of unsatisfied curiosity, how that's landed for me, if there was any impact from that, because I remember that memory very vividly. And I also remember a lot of memories of my brother having a lot of sex. My brother was 6 years older than me. I was 10. I was 9. He was 15, 16, 17, and there was just a lot of sex happening in the house. And not just him, but his friends as well. And I remember there were a couple of moments where, unbeknownst to me, I walked in on sex, and sex was always, talked about by him and his friends. Sex and death metal were, the main things that they talked about, and Married with Children as well. So I just saw sex a lot, and I just heard it talked about so much that it didn't occur as anything like special or sacred or intimate, or it just seemed like an act to do and acquire. And and that was just my interpretation of. I'm not saying all teenage boys talk about it like that. I'm just saying that's how it occurred to me, because it just seems so. What's the word I'm looking for? Frivolous and consistent, the way that it was talked about and joked about. And so I would say the first 10 years, maybe even 15 years of my sex life, I just didn't hold anything special or sacred about it, and it was plentiful and something for me to consistently attain. And I felt, and I had a lot of reflection a lot of times, like, you're like a teenage boy, when it comes to sex, and that was a product of this subtle trauma of being raised by my brother and his and all of his buddies. So I'd be curious to know if there are some ways that you can think of that your upbringing, in addition to and aside from any specific, abuse or molestation events, if you can think of some subtle sexual trauma that happened over time in your house, when it comes to the way your family dealt with the body, when it comes to the way that your family dealt with or didn't deal with sex, your family, your extended family, your culture, how that sort of has seeped into your system and has helped influence on some level the way, number one, the way in which you have sex, the way in which you relate to yourself as a sexual being, and the way in which you develop or form your relationships, like how that lives inside of your partnership, your dating, and or your marriage. So I'm going to end here, but I'm going to add a little tag. I think I'm going to add a little tag at the end of this, like I do sometimes, but this one is from some ideas that I just put on video earlier this week after my interview with Laura Worley, who's amazing when it comes to sexual trauma healing. So I'm going to add a little tag from something I recorded, some ideas that I just put on tape after my interview with her. But goodbye for now. Happy healing. And, when it comes to sexual trauma, there's so many different layers that it lives within inside of us that it's sometimes hard to notice that we're even being influenced by trauma, that it just sort of sometimes feels like it is the way it is. And especially when two people come together who have different sexual traumas, some of which they're aware of and some of which they aren't, that it could feel as if, oh, we're not a fit, or we're this amazing, magical, fireworks kind of sexual fit with each other. And is that because your system has been influenced in a healthy way? That because, and I know I've mentioned this before, but because you can communicate so well sexually, does that necessarily mean you're communicating that well in different departments or categories of the relationship? And oftentimes I think, like, when sex isn't working the way that we want it to, there's some unhealed trauma there, some unaddressed trauma there, that sometimes having a relationship with somebody that you really, really appreciate them, but the sex isn't working that well, that there can be some sexual healing that can open up connection in that area. And also I know I said I was done, but another thing that was beautifully mentioned by Dr. Larry Heller was the vulnerability the level of vulnerability that is possible with sex. And sometimes, people say, like, we had great sex, but it wasn't really connected. The mechanics were working really well. But the ultimate desire for a lot of people is to drop into this vulnerable place because your body is open. Your bodies are together, touching the skin. The skin is connecting in all different areas. Fluids being mixed, and everything is sort of like melding together. And it's the vulnerability and connection that is possible, so possible that sometimes we just ignore it, we're afraid of it, we don't feel safe, and so we fall into the mechanics. And that in and of itself is a sexual response, is a sexual trauma response. And then some people say, like, I wanted to connect with them and they weren't connectable, they weren't available. That could also be potentially you're watching somebody, you're having sex with somebody and watching them having a sexual trauma response. Or you're being with somebody and you're having a sexual trauma response, but you're not telling them and you're not even aware that you're having one. Okay, I'm definitely signing off now. I'm going to add a little tag after this, and a lot of those ideas that I just threw out there will be fleshed out more in the Trust Yourself Again Summit coming out next month. Happy healing. Thanks for listening. Have an awesome weekend, everybody. Bye-bye. Interviewed Laura Worley, who's an amazing healer. Her interview will be coming out, I think, probably in the middle of the summit. And it's a video on sexual trauma. It's an interview on sexual trauma, and I really sort of really connected to this notion of ritual that she brought up. She brought up the notion of ritual even when it comes to sex, and not specifically sex. Like, she mentions an alcoholic who, the ritual of like cracking open the beer and the feeling of the, tab in your finger, and then hearing the crack open of the beer, and then that first sip of beer. How, the ritual, a ritual sort of gets settled into our system, this ritual of habit. And it becomes like every layer of it is satisfactory. Every layer of it is comfortable and familiar. And so we don't necessarily long for just the taste of the beer, or just the taste of the alcohol, or the taste of the cigarette or the drug. It's the entire ritual. Like when I used to smoke a lot of pot when I was a kid, and I just loved the ritual of breaking up the weed, and we had to separate the stems and seeds back then, rolling up the joint and, licking the sticky part of the paper, the whole ritual. And so when it comes to sex, I really was like into this thought of the ritual of the, teasing, flirting, the ritual of kissing and foreplay and fooling around, and the ritual of sex. And when it comes to sexual trauma, there's this familiarity in the ritual. However it is that your style of sex, or your style of mating, or your style of fooling around, or what it is that you like to do during sex, it's like ritualistic. And those of us who've been sexually traumatized, I experienced this, where when the acts of the sexual trauma that happened when I was a child, when that is repeated, and I don't just mean like the disrespect or the offense or or things happen that I didn't, the abusive part of it, but the actual physical actions that happen when they're repeated as an adult. I might not be being abused, but it feels like I am, because it's the same ritual that happened when I was a child, when I was abused. And so Sorry, I just have like a flood of thoughts coming to my brain. So number one, the ritual of repeating the action will occur as an abusive act, which is why a lot of people either they stay away from sex or they stay away from dating or they overload on sex and dating because the ritual is so familiar and they have to stay on the hamster wheel of that ritual. And it also causes a narcissistic form of sex because you're having sex with somebody else, but you're just repeating what you're used to. You're repeating the ritual that you know and that is in your cell memory. And that causes a lot of disconnected sex because you're not paying attention to the person that there's actually somebody on the other end of what you're doing because the person who abused you wasn't paying attention to what you wanted, right? So they were repeating some ritual, and then we go and we repeat some ritual, or we are in the receiving. Like my body and my cell memory is used to being on the receiving end of this ritual. Like my ritual is just like saying okay, even though I don't want this, but I'm so used to saying okay, even though I don't want this. Like that's my ritual. That's what I'm used to. That's what's familiar to me. And I think it's an interesting take to put it in the theory and context of ritual and tradition. And that's one of the reasons why people pass on sexual trauma and can you hear that? Oh, it just stopped. Why people pass on sexual abuse. It's the ritual that they're used to. It's the way in which they are used to operating. And once we heal that sexual trauma, sexual abuse, whether we're the abuser or the abusee, then sexual trauma or sexual abuse we won't pass it on anymore. And it's easy to say, well, I haven't abused anybody. But if you've been abused, you are the recipient and holder of sexual trauma. If you have sexually abused somebody, even if you don't feel that you have, but maybe the person you've been with has said that you have, then you're holding sexual trauma, whether you are the giver or receiver of the sexual trauma. And even just being somebody who once your turn on is triggered, there are very specific things that you want. And so you go after those specific things. And then there's somebody on the other end, which was me. When I was in a relationship where I was sexually abused, it seemed like my partner was going after all of the things that he wanted that would satisfy him. And then I was on the other end going, okay, I will just give and provide all the things that you want that satisfy you. And so as I've healed my sexual trauma, my ritual has completely shifted to I'm now aware of both parts, of both sides. I'm aware of my partner, of what my partner wants and doesn't want. I'm aware of what I want and what I don't want. I'm able to speak it. And I'm not playing some unconscious role in order to protect myself and keep myself safe and people please. Because that is the product of who I was when I had unhealed trauma. So what are some of what you may think are your sexual rituals? It could be it could be masturbating every day or 3 times a day or not masturbating at all. It could be like, well, I do this thing with my partner, whether or not they want it to happen or not, we do it anyway. Or I receive this thing from my partner, whether or not I want to do it or not, I do it anyway. Or I'm with a partner and we have like amazing moments where it seems as if there's an equal give and take, and then there's moments where it doesn't seem like that at all, or I don't have sex at all. That's my sexual ritual. So what are some of the things that are your sexual ritual? And Ritual, tradition, habit are all very, very similar. So I'm kind of taking away the negativity around sexual trauma, which there's a whole bunch of feeling, there's a whole bunch of sensation, there's a whole bunch of scars and wounds when it comes to sexual trauma. And just putting in the context of ritual, tradition, and habit, what are your rituals, traditions, and habits that, when it comes to sex, that may be a product of your sexual trauma? Complacency, also. Complacency could be another ritual, habit, tradition, a way in which you're just used to being when it comes to sex.